Today I bring you a special episode because today we get not just one, but two Overlord characters in the same video. Yep, that's right. This time we're covering the twin siblings and joint floor guardians of Nazaric's 6th floor, Aura and Mare Power, creations of Ainz Ul Go'n guild member Buku Buku Chugama, who was the older sister of the highly cultured man that was Pararonchino. But before we get into it, as usual, here's a quick merch plug. Now, let's begin. So, I think we should start with the youngest, Mare Power, Italian for beautiful flower of the sea. He's very introverted, shy, cowardly, and effeminate, especially with regards to his interactions with other denizens of Nazarick. But despite his appearance, personality, and pretty name, he is unequivocally a male, and as if to solidify this fact, the word used to refer to beauty in his name is bello, the male-gendered version of the term. Anyway, his favorite hobby is to quietly read books by himself. When not working, he would frequently borrow books from Nazarick's library Ashurbanipal. He also comes across as extremely self-conscious about everything, as if he's always afraid of failing. Then there's the times where he can be absent-minded, in a way that honestly can be seen as bordering on autistic, due to the difficulty he has understanding the thoughts and opinions of others. Despite all this though, he's very diligent, and if left to his own devices while devoid of too much pressure, he can be a very efficient and effective servant of Nazarick. As for his older sister now, she's Aura Power, meaning beautiful flower of the air, this time with the female-gendered version of the word beauty. Now, unlike her brother, she's an athletic, outgoing, and fearless tomboy, though can still be somewhat effeminate at times, especially when around Ainz. As I'm sure you've seen in the anime, she's a big fan of collecting and training various beasts and creatures. She loves playing games with them, training them to do tricks, and even getting into playfights with them. Generally, the more powerful or rare the creature, the better, although she doesn't mind weak ones so long as they're interesting or useful. For instance, in one case, she trained a bunch of little mandrakes to pop out of the ground and scream, "Long live Ainz Ul Go'n" on command. So it's stuff like that that keeps her occupied. Now, as a level 100 NPC, she could probably wrestle a run-of-the-mill dragon to the ground with her bare hands. Of course, a dragon lord might give her a bit more trouble, but she rarely needs to do this since most feral creatures realize instinctually that she's an extremely dangerous high-level person, and they become easily intimidated by her. Though, despite her interest in most living creatures, she absolutely hates insects. As a matter of fact, she is routinely disgusted by some of Nazarick's more gruesome insectoid denizens. I imagine someone like Kyohuko would be a prime example. But she doesn't seem to have too much trouble interacting with Cocytus or Antoma, as their outward appearances aren't too creepy. Well, at least not until Antoma's mask falls off and she loses her voice bug. Then we get into some nightmare fuel. Now, as it is with many of the other floor guardians, in order to really understand why these two have the personality, mannerisms, and appearances that they do, it's important to understand their creator, Buku Buku Chugama. If you've been following our Who is Overlord series for some time now, then you probably already know why this is. But for those of you who are watching this for the first time, welcome, and here's why we like to analyze their creator too. As the person that brought them into existence, Buku Buku Chugama specified not only their appearance but a majority of their personality, meaning whatever her interests and personality may have been, they would have largely influenced how she made Aura and Mare. But keep in mind that during the transition from video game to the new world, they, as did all the other NPCs, inherited limited aspects of their creator's personality in ways that weren't quite specified in their lore or backstory. For instance, we mentioned in the Who is Shaltir series that Shaltir and Aura often get into fights, mirroring the way that their respective creators would often feud. But just as relevant is that despite this feud, the two of them share a very close bond, and Aura always feels a strong desire to watch over Shaltir, in a way that's similar to how an older sister would. It's much the same way that Buku Buku Chugama was always looking out for Pararonchino. Speaking of which, with Pararonchino, we were able to look into a lot of his personal tastes. But what about Buku Buku Chugama? It's probably hard to imagine that she'd be anything remotely close to her brother. So what exactly is the deal with her? Well, let's take a closer look for a minute. Buku Buku Chugama was one of 3 female members within Ainz Ul Go'n, the other 2 being Yamaiko and Enkoro Mochi Mochi. She was a very skilled player whose character was a pink slime that acted as a frontline tank. Not only was she excellent at aggro management, but she was highly competent at being a group leader for raids. As for her name, it translates to simmering or bubbling teapot, with buku buku being the bubble sound effect and chugama meaning teapot. In real life, she was a voice actress that went by the stage name Kazeyumi Kumi. She specialized in young, cutesy lolly characters, ones that could mainly be found in anime, video games, and even some erotic content, which actually caused a significant amount of suffering for Peroncino, as he would often have difficulty appreciating such works when he heard his older sister's voice in them. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about the anime or the video games. But much like her younger brother, she liked teasing and playing jokes on others, so she would often use her stage voice and cute shy personality when interacting with other guildmates. Her normal personality was a lot more outgoing, assertive, and even tomboyish, which ended up producing an amusing contrast. In most scenarios, she acted like your run-of-the-mill sweet anime character, but when she got upset, that's when her usual persona would slip out, and in her anger or frustration, she could become frighteningly scary. This would mainly happen when her younger brother did something stupid or ridiculous that ended up embarrassing her. So now knowing this, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with it. Accordingly, this personality dichotomy is reflected in the personality of her two NPCs, Aura and Mare. Specifically, Aura's personality and mannerisms bear strong resemblance to Buku Buku Chagama's normal personality, particularly when she's interacting with Mare or Shaltir. Now, by contrast, Mare inherited more of the false, cutesy, effeminate persona. But that's not to say that their respective personalities were an accident. No, it's most likely that she created Aura as kind of a self-insert, while Mare was probably designed to be docile because of her constant fights with her annoying younger brother. Ironically, instead of a younger brother who was annoying because he was too independent and would never do what she told him, Mare was the opposite. He would constantly annoy Aura because he was far too dependent on her, and he needed her to tell him what to do and give him encouragement. In fact, he seems far more independent and competent when away from his sister, but more on that aspect later. There's actually another reason why Buku Buku Chagama created them to have these personalities, and to put it in the easiest way that I can, she simply liked traps. Which brings us back to this recurring theme of Gap Moe, something that's commonly found all throughout Nazarick. In Buku Buku Chagama's case, it's implied that she was a fan of Guro Kawaii, or Kimo Kawaii, both meaning grotesque cute. Think Mori Chak's gloomy bear, or even her character. Her attempt at this gross cute character was this pink slime avatar, though it turned out to be a bit of a failure since no one in the guild thought that this slime was cute in any way. Similarly, it's likely that Buku Buku Chagama enjoyed the Gap Moe aspect of traps as well. Trap being the word from otaku culture, describing a character that appears to be a specific gender due to their expressions and mannerisms, but are in fact the opposite gender. Essentially, it's a man that appears to be a woman, or a woman that appears to be a man. They are affectionately known as traps because they trick the viewer or reader into being attracted to something that they would not normally be attracted to, often cross-dressing as well in order to exacerbate the confusion. And to further that to its uppermost limit, they're often designed androgynously, meaning the masculine or feminine traits that normally distinguish a gender are now rather ambiguous, as if they have a combination of both. Now, while Buku Buku Chagama may certainly not be as cultured as her brother, perhaps she had her own brand of eccentric interests. Even Ein suspected that she would feel quite embarrassed if she ever had to meet her creations. After all, traps themselves can be a fetish. Attraction to androgyny goes all the way back to Greek times. So perhaps she's secretly a fan of shotas or male traps, since ultimately many Nazarick denizens were designed to appeal to their creators' fetishistic desires, making the reasonings behind her twin sibling creations not too strange, all things considered anyway. What does seem rather strange though is the curious contradiction between Mari's personality when interacting with Nazarick denizens as opposed to the New Worlders. We've seen this in other Nazarick denizens before, like Albedo, Demiurge, or Shaltir. To them, New Worlders are basically insects at best, or playthings to oppress at worst. By contrast, fellow Nazarick denizens, no matter how pathetic, are still deserving of, if not respect, then at least dignity, so long as they obey the will of the Supreme One anyway. Similarly, while Mare is extremely cowardly and docile in the presence of other Nazarick denizens, this ultimately doesn't apply when interacting with New Worlders. This is partly because despite his outward personality, both he and his sister have a karma rating of -100. We've discussed this before, but karma had various gameplay effects in Yggdrasil. Of course, when the NPCs were given life in the New World, their karma ratings were folded into and became a core part of their personality as a whole. While it's never precisely specified what different karma ratings actually translate to, we can explore the behavioral patterns of those with different ratings. Ratings of around 100 or above roughly mark someone as good aligned. They tend to demonstrate empathy and concern for the well-being of most, if not all, other life forms, including New Worlders, and at the extreme end, this can manifest as a positive desire to improve their well-being or even protect them. Basically, the higher your karma rating, the more likely you are to go out of your way to proactively assist others. Now, ratings below -100 generally mark someone as evil aligned. They tend to manifest open hostility and disdain for the well-being of New Worlders, and in extreme cases, this may manifest as outright sadism or just pure hostility towards their very existence. Basically, the very fact that New Worlders are alive is so offensive and so disgusting that they go out of their way to make their lives as miserable as possible, or at least feel the urge to stamp out their lives immediately upon witnessing them. Finally, ratings between plus and -100 roughly correspond to neutral, and it reflects individuals who have a more pragmatic view of others. Those who tilt more towards evil have a greater proclivity towards murder and other evil acts, while those who tilt more towards good are more likely to be generous and kind, though exactly how they behave tends to depend on the person. With Mare and Aura sitting at -100, at the very cusp of the border between neutral and evil, this translates to extreme apathy for the lives and well-being of all but a handful of people. Presumably, if you could somehow earn Mare's respect or admiration, or even his attention, he might actually care what happens to you. But for the most part, he'll barely even acknowledge your existence. We see that despite his shy, passive, and cowardly demeanor, on multiple occasions he's committed cruel acts of evil. Like, he had no trouble kidnapping Hilma by bashing her leg in with his staff and dragging her while she was screaming out of her house by the hair. And the reason for that was only because he was nervous about being late and wanted to make sure that she couldn't run. Or how about when both Mare and Aura were sent to intimidate Jerkniv after the workers' invasion? He destroys half his royal guard with a single earthquake spell, killing hundreds with a mere wave of his staff, and without even batting an eye. As a matter of fact, the only thing that stopped him from murdering literally everyone in the city was the order that Ainz gave telling him to find the Emperor. You see, Mare was concerned that if he killed everyone in the city, then certainly the Emperor would have died too, and he'd fail his mission. So you can tell from this that he barely views the New Worlders as living creatures. But let's say he had to fight another Nazarick NPC. He would likely be too afraid of screwing up to even put up much resistance. So to him, New World denizens are like inanimate objects, little more than a patch of weeds. Actually, on second thought, they may be more akin to a grain of sand or a rock, because it's a little known fact that he actually enjoys collecting plants. Calling New Worlders weeds might be giving them a little bit too much credit. So if Ainz ordered him to pick up a rock and give it to him, yeah, he'll go and do it. And if said rock starts screaming "let me go" or "don't hurt me," well, it's just a rock, right? That's pretty much Mare's mentality. Now, Aura on the other hand is a little bit more socially aware than her younger brother. She seems to recognize that other living creatures outside of Nazarick actually do exist as independent life forms, but she sees no inherent value in their lives. In fact, you could be forgiven for thinking that she bears a lot of similarity with Demiurge, since she does sometimes indulge in bouts of sadism when it comes to other creatures. As a matter of fact, since her hobby is collecting and training vicious beasts, she probably views humans as we might view animals. In fact, many of her pets are intelligent enough to hold a conversation or can even be about as smart as humans. I mean, she did want to capture Hamsky and turn him into one of her pets after all. So, to her, some animals can make for good pets, others for good food, and others that are just wild or rabid need to be put down. And unlike many of the other truly evil NPCs, she's not very sadistic, more like apathetic. Some animals she'll care a lot for, as if they were a cute puppy. But for most animals, including humans and other intelligent demi-humans, she doesn't really seem to care what happens to them, and will happily kill them if asked to. So that's pretty much everything on their creator and respective personalities. Now, what about their responsibilities as Floor Guardians? As we've discussed in the past, Floor Guardians hold an elevated position in Nazarick, as if they were the personal lieutenants of the Supreme Ones. Ainz generally gives orders to them directly, and it's their job to relay these orders to their relevant underlings. But before we get to their exact responsibilities, let's first talk about the floor that they were tasked with guarding, the jungle. This is Nazric's 6th floor, and it was constructed mostly by the guild member Blue Planet. He wanted to create a natural forest that was unspoiled by humans, the reason being due to the current state of the world. You see, Overlord actually takes place in the 22nd century, specifically the year 2138, and in this timeline, Earth's ecosystem and environment have been absolutely devastated. People that walk outside have to wear these thick protective suits and masks just to avoid getting sick from all the toxic fumes in the air. It's likely a pretty accurate outlook of our current future. Anyway, Blue Planet was a bit of an environmental romanticist. He looked on with longing and wonder at the VR-constructed vistas and forests, and obsessed over how life may have been like in the past. Particularly how mankind could bask in clean air while taking walks through lively landscapes rich with nature. So, of course, his name was a reference to the blue planet that he so yearned for. The 6th floor was basically his pet project, with the vast majority of it just being forests and grassy plains. But he also constructed the night sky as well, modeling it after the stars in the sky. Stars that he could never see in person due to the thick cloud of pollution which blotted out even the sun. It was made to realistically model the passing of day and night, and even the Earth's rotation around the sun. However, the ceiling was only 200 meters high, and the dimensions of this floor are comparable to any other floor, though it is a convincing enough illusion to create the impression that the floor is unending. That being said, the jungle is home to various landmarks. We first have the gigantic tree, which serves as Aura and Mare's home. Then the large hole, which is home to the parasite-like monster Goshakukochuo from the 5 Worst. And then we have what's considered to be the most prominent location, the amphitheater, a lifelike reimagining of the ancient Roman Colosseum, and the location where captured invaders would do battle while members of Ainzul Gon would watch from the VIP box above. Basically, teleportation traps would pull invaders into the Colosseum, and they'd be forced to battle against endless waves of increasingly difficult foes. It's presumed that escape would also be blocked via magic. Apparently, every major invasion, except for the massive 1500-man multi-guild one, met their end here. It would seem that the guild members of Ainzul Gon had some powerful combinations of monsters to whittle down their enemies with. Finally, the last major location of the jungle is what's called Project Utopia, a settlement informally known as the Green Hole. It's comprised of self-sufficient sentient plant creatures, and it was created by Ainz as a means to convince others that Nazric could coexist peacefully with the denizens of the New World. Later, it would be used to grow various crops in order to help sustain Nazric's operations. You can find here the mandrakes that Aura trains, as well as a dryad known as Pinison Pulperlia, who joined Nazric in an audio drama released as bonus material. Other residents include a few lizardmen, as well as the elven slaves that served under Area Uzruth, the one who got wrecked by Hamske when he and the rest of the worker teams invaded Nazric. Yeah, so if you were ever wondering where those 3 slaves ended up, this would be the place. Ainz had spared their lives since they had not invaded Nazric of their own volition. He decided to hand them over to Aura and Mare since he wanted the 2 siblings to socialize with members of their own kind. Interestingly, these 2 have a condition known as heterochromia, meaning different colored eyes, which some readers theorize is a marker of elven royalty in the New World. This is because the property is also shared by the king of the Nation of Elves, which is south of the slain theocracy. This king was a petty tyrant who had sent many female elven women to the front line during the war with the theocracy, some of whom could have been captured as POWs, then abused and broken, and eventually sold as slaves to citizens in the Baharluth Empire, which ultimately explains where these elven slave girls came from. Now, as floor guardians of the 6th floor, Aura and Mare's responsibilities would effectively be to meet any encroaching invaders in battle, but as we start talking about that, it'll begin to draw a lot of connections to their build, which is something that's a bit more fitting for part 2 of this video. So let's hold out for that one, where we'll go over how strong they are, what their build and class design is, what they're capable of, as well as how these capabilities determine the scope of their responsibilities in Nazric. How strong are Aura and Mare Bellofiore? Well, that's more of a 2-parter question because Aura and Mare don't quite have the same build. Like, Mare is an extremely powerful spellcaster, whose strength is said to rival even Shaltir's for the title of strongest floor guardian, while Aura is a very skilled ranger and beast tamer, who can bring the most vicious of creatures under her command. So I think it'd be best to talk about their builds separately. And who better to start off with than the timid younger brother, Mare, the unreliable disciple of nature. Mare and Aura are a type of elf known as a dark elf, a race of humanoid beings similar to the wood elves that are common in fantasy games. In traditional stories, elves were short creatures with pointy ears. Think Santa's Little Helpers. But elves in modern fantasy RPGs, including the fictional MMO Yggdrasil from Overlord, are often styled after the mythos constructed by J.R.R. Tolkien. They're beings that are just as tall as humans, but also more agile, slender, and beautiful. And they have a graceful and noble culture that is at one with nature and magic. Many of these traits were adopted by tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, then made their way onto early computer RPGs like Ultima and Baldur's Gate. They eventually became a mainstay of the genre when they were implemented in fantasy MMORPGs like World of Warcraft. But specifically in Dungeons & Dragons and other Western fantasy RPGs, dark elves are sometimes evil elf variants, also known as Drow. They normally make their homes underground or inside caves and tunnels rather than in trees and forests like their wood elf relatives. However, in Japanese fantasy fiction, dark elves are more often just dark-skinned elves, with no major cultural or personality distinctions to regular elves. Sometimes they can live in deserts or other hot, arid climates which tan their skin, but more often than not, they reside in forests just like their lighter-skinned counterparts. They just happen to have a darker complexion for some reason. Though it's not clear which variant that Maruyama, the author of Overlord, borrowed more heavily from. Now, their appearance is styled after a typical Japanese dark elf, with a slightly more brownish tan. A fun fact though, it's said in the novels that the Great Forest of Tob, which lies near Nazarick, was once populated by dark elves. So using this information, dark elves don't appear to be subterranean creatures, at least not in the world of Overlord, placing Aura and Mare farther from the idea of them being a typical Western dark elf. But as we discussed in the last video, Aura and Mare are quite evil by nature, and while this may be a result of Buku Buku Chagama's decision to give them a negative karma rating, it could also be that dark elves and Maruyama's Overlord are an inherently evil race by nature. Speaking of race, the Elvish one is classified as humanoid in Yggdrasil. Therefore, dark elves can't gain any racial levels, unlike the majority of denizens of Nazarick who are either demi-human or heteromorphic. As such, the humanoid races tend to come with fewer and smaller advantages and disadvantages. Their weaknesses weren't extremely obvious and easily exploitable like the heteromorphs, and their buffs merely boosted their capabilities and powers. This made them far more versatile and easier to play. Heteromorphs though could be much stronger, but at the same time, very vulnerable to a prepared enemy. Take for example the undead's many weaknesses to healing, holy attacks, and cleric's undead turning. Now, since Yggdrasil borrows so much from Dungeons & Dragons, it makes sense to talk about how elves and dark elves work in that game, as it more than likely relates to Mare and Aura's inherent abilities. So basically, both types of elves are generally more agile but less tough than other humanoids. They gain a bonus to dexterity, which is their ability to hit enemies with ranged attacks or dodge out of the way of certain attacks and various spells. In exchange, they get a penalty to what's called Constitution, something that affects their ability to resist certain effects like poison and disease, as well as reduces their overall health pool. Neither type of elves sleep, and thus they can't be put to sleep with magic or poison. Their minds are sharper too, making them slightly more difficult to bewitch or control with magic spells. On top of this, their sight and hearing are even more powerful, meaning they can hear sneaking foes, spot hiding enemies, or search for secret doors and hidden treasures much more easily. Then, dark elves have a selection of additional abilities, over and above their basic elven counterparts. To start with, they're actually more intelligent and charismatic, making them better at being spellcasters and clerics. They gain a special supernatural defense known as spell resistance, which gives them a good chance to outright ignore the effects of any spell, with the exact chance being based on their level and how powerful the enemy spellcaster is. Furthermore, their minds are even more resistant to influence and control than elves, and they gain a further bonus to all mind-altering attacks. These include the indirect ones like illusions, as well as effects that aren't technically spells, like psychic abilities. Then, they also have access to a few relatively simple, weak spells, mostly revolving around the creation of magical light and darkness, though those can only be used once a day. Dark vision is also an ability that they have which allows them to always see up to around 120 feet in any direction, even in pitch black darkness. As creatures who are sometimes born and live in caves where there is no natural source of light, this was pretty essential to functioning. Incidentally, this is also why their eyes glow in a dim light, like certain nocturnal animals. Though this ability to see in the dark normally comes with a cost, as in they're easily blinded by bright light sources. Regardless, it wouldn't be surprising if Aura and Mare possessed all of these additional advantages, but ultimately, we only know for a fact that they possess dark vision, assumed to be without any supposed bright light weaknesses. I mean, they don't appear to demonstrate any difficulty seeing outdoors during bright sunny days. And as floor guardians of floor 6, they would be spending the majority of their time in a brightly lit coliseum on a floor with a functioning day-night cycle. Overall though, as elves, they're likely more resistant than their humanoid counterparts to various types of mind-altering spells. But since dark elves are a humanoid race, they don't have racial levels, meaning in Yggdrasil, all of their advantages and bonuses wouldn't be that much better than any of the other humanoid races, including their fellow elves. It would seem that both elves and dark elves most likely gain a slight boost to their observation abilities, especially thanks to their good vision, and then they may be more resistant to certain kinds of spells, but they don't have any particularly powerful abilities or weaknesses like the other races that we've discussed in this series so far. We also know very little about their classes, but as usual, that's not going to stop us. It's still enough to speculate a little bit. And of course, we can always rely on the fact that Maruyama borrowed heavily from Dungeons & Dragons in order to give us a bit of an idea. So, as I said in the beginning, let's start with the younger brother of the two, Mare. Mare's class archetype is actually that of a druid. Specifically, he has 10 levels in druid, 10 levels in High Druid, 10 levels in Nature's Herald, 5 levels in Disciple of Disaster, and 10 levels in Forest Mage, with another 55 levels unaccounted for. And although we mentioned this in a prior video involving one of the 5 worst, Druid is a class that specializes in nature-related spells, usually nature-themed buffs, controlling plants, manipulating the earth, and summoning and controlling various animals. The word itself comes from a kind of high-ranking priest from ancient Celtic religions. It became quite popular in fantasy fiction and video games to signify divine spellcasters whose powers, unlike clerics, were not derived from a god but rather nature itself. They had various capabilities, depending on how high of a level you were. You could befriend wild animals, recruit an animal companion to fight in battle with you, move through restrictive or dangerous terrain with ease, gain bonuses to specific nature-related skills, have immunity to being tracked, resistance to spells cast by fairies, immunity to poisons, or even have the ability to moderately adjust your appearance at will. That being said though, the author of Overlord did list Albedo, Demiurge, and Sibas as the only 3 NPCs with the ability to actively transform as a class ability, which would suggest that druids in Overlord, or at least Mare's version of druid, doesn't share this capability with their D&D cousins. Similarly, most of these other class capabilities haven't even been confirmed in Overlord, so it's possible that druids in Yggdrasil may not have even had most of these special abilities. It's just something to keep in mind so that you know what's not outside of the realm of possibility. What we do know is that he does have animal companions, specifically a pair of extremely high-level dragons, one of which he and Aura rode into Jerkniv's capital city on. These dragons were obtained from one of Yggdrasil's gacha games, which, if you weren't aware, is basically Japan's version of loot boxes. Yggdrasil's monetization scheme was notoriously exploitative, and it was possible to spend money on these gacha lotteries to obtain various in-game benefits like gear or creatures. I mean, it was practically pay to win. But back to the ability itself. In Dungeons & Dragons, rangers and druids could only have regular animals as companions, with the strength of the animal dependent on the level of the character. A high-level player might have a wolf, tiger, or dinosaur, while a low-level player might have a dog, eagle, or snake. It wasn't meant to be a full-on class feature, just a nice little bonus that made the classes seem more nature-oriented. Yggdrasil, on the other hand, as it usually does, seems to make this skill much more powerful, allowing it to apply to much more powerful, high-level magical beasts, like dragons, and also apparently allowing 2 rather than just 1 companion. The recruitment probably wouldn't work against anything too humanoid, particularly any playable race, as well as anything that was too monstrous. That means things like angels, demons, slimes, constructs, undead, and giants are all probably out. It might work on plant creatures, fairies, or elementals, but that's also not a guarantee. Think animals, dragons, or things that kind of look like animals, like the Barghest from Season 3. Now, the most important class ability of druids, and the one that we see most prominently in Overlord, is their robust selection of nature-related spells. While it's not been specified exactly what kind of spells that Mare might specialize in, we can speculate a good deal on what that may be. For instance, we've seen him use some kind of earthquake-esque spell on screen to kill a bunch of Durkniv's royal guard. This, likely being the earthquake spell, affects an 80-foot radius around the designated origin point, and it causes intense tremors, which produces various effects dependent upon the terrain. In a city, buildings and tunnels would collapse, trapping and crushing characters caught inside them. On open terrain, fissures in the earth expand, and anyone who doesn't react fast enough can fall inside and also get crushed. If you're in a body of water, these fissures would form whirlpools, pulling creatures down to the bottom and possibly drowning them. Muddy terrains likewise turns to quicksand and pulls characters in, though it's not a very good spell against high-level characters, because the potency of the attack doesn't scale much at all with your character level. However, it is a very efficient and effective spell for killing large groups of weaklings. We also know that he has the 6th level terrain manipulation spell called Earth Surge, which functions very similarly to the 6th level D&D spell Move Earth. This spell can't affect rock, but it can move dirt and other loose earth substances like clay and sand as if it were a very sluggish and viscous wave of liquid. The overall reach of the change allowed one to move an area of earth that was approximately 150 feet in length and width into whatever shape that the caster wanted every 10 minutes or so. Of course, assuming that the end result was something that would remain structurally stable after the effect had ended. Those end results would typically be a smoothly curving hill or a flat plain. It doesn't violently break the ground like an earthquake, nor is it quick enough to trap or bury creatures like quicksand. In fact, structures, creatures, and other objects that occupy the terrain, such as trees, are mostly unaffected, magically shifting up or down with the surface of the terrain. In Yggdrasil, the exact area of effect might be different, but apparently, Mare is able to affect a distance of around 350 feet across, or just over 100 meters. Though, at the time that he was noted doing that, he was also using one of his class skills. Regardless though, the rough effect of moving Earth remains the same. Mare also may have been responsible for the 6th tier weather manipulation spell called Control Weather, the one that we saw Nazarick use to intimidate the Lizardmen back in Season 2. This allows the caster to freely manipulate all aspects of the weather, producing powerful effects like tornadoes, thunderstorms, heat waves, torrential rain, hailstorms, sleet, fog, blizzards, flash frost, and so on, as well as allows you to remove these effects and produce more mild ones like overcast or sunny days. But that's yet to be confirmed. It just fits most accordingly with Mare's build. Now, one interesting facet of druids that's commonly found in D&D but we haven't really talked about was that they're also very skilled at fighting. Many of their spells were traditional buff spells, and like I said, druids in Dungeons & Dragons would often combine these with their transformation ability to make themselves extremely powerful. Yggdrasil doesn't have transformations per se, but it's possible druids are meant to be better warriors than spellcasters. The reason I propose this is because Mare's base stats are actually extremely well balanced. As a matter of fact, he has some of the highest stats total amongst all the known NPCs, tied with Albedo at 690. This puts him below only one other NPC whose stats are actually known, Sheltir at 732. That said, Gargantua's is even higher, placing his stats at the highest of all the NPCs. Similarly, Rubedo probably had even better stats than that. Aside from that though, while Mare's physical attack is still a bit lower than his magical attack, he might still make for a decent hybrid character if he buffs himself with some abilities. I mean, even with his appearance making him look like some kind of wizard with just a cloth armor dress skirt and a staff, he's not nearly as weak or squishy as you might think. Now, what about the rest of his classes? So we've explained Druid for the most part, and Higher Druid is probably just a higher tier upgrade of that, enhancing all Druid related powers and granting access to higher leveled spells. But what about Nature's Herald? That one seems a bit interesting. Herald is a term for the messenger of a king or monarch, essentially fulfilling the role of a modern ambassador or a diplomat. It also has some religious connotations. In Christianity, for instance, God is said to employ many different angels as his heralds. Herald, especially as a class, is usually used in this religious connotation for most different fantasy RPGs. Clerics, for instance, could communicate directly to their gods and be given instructions, some of which would be to act as heralds in order to give others instructions or blessings. And with druid magic being classified as divine magic, one that's powered by the druid's spiritual communion with the natural world, it's likely that Nature's Herald improves upon the more cleric-like abilities of druids, mainly their healing and buffing spells, making them stronger, more potent, and effective less costly, and granting access to better variations. One of Mare's known buff spells is actually called the Power of Gaia, Gaia being the Greek pantheon, the personification of planet Earth as a primordial goddess, which explains why it might be a fitting spell for a Herald of Nature to use, and it seems to be a spell that provides some kind of strength enhancement. It's also likely that her main AoE healing spells also come from this class. Then we have the Forest Mage class, which is also pretty interesting. It really just does sound like a synonym for Druid, doesn't it? But Druids weren't just focused on plants or trees. Rather, it was all of nature, including things like oceans, mountains, the sky, deserts, and so on. They even had influence over the primal elements of earth, fire, water, and air. In light of this fact, a Forest Mage might just be a derivative class of Druid that focuses on enhancing and broadening their plant-related abilities. After all, Buku Buku Chagama had written in his bio that Mare liked plants, so perhaps she gave him this as a compliment to that bit of flavor text. As for its abilities, perhaps this class allows him to summon plant creatures, bind his enemies with vines, or maybe even animate trees and other plant-like creatures to fight for him. It seems to also be useful for utility. In D&D, there exists a druid spell called Tree Stride, which allows the caster to enter into a tree and exit out of another one that's hundreds or thousands of feet away, giving the ability to jump repeatedly between trees a number of times based on the caster's skill. In a similar vein, Mare has a buff spell called Woodland Stride, which seems to be used to increase the target's mobility and maybe even provide a similar effect. Or it might just increase the user's running speed over woodland terrains. Who knows? Regardless, whether offensive, defensive, or utility, there are likely many plant or wood-related spells that are probably the providence of forest mages. And finally, Mare has a class known as Disciple of Disaster. This sounds suspiciously similar to Ulbert Elaine Odell's signature class, World Disaster, which was a secret class that you could only get by killing its previous owner. And it allowed the user to use large amounts of MP to power up their spells way past their normal limit, granting the ability to deal massive quantities of damage in an extremely short period of time. Now, this class might not be as secret as World Disaster, and it may not even bear any similarities in function to each other, but the name does suggest that it provides extremely destructive, powerful abilities. So what exactly could it be referring to? Well, think about it. What do you get when you combine nature with disaster? Well, you get a natural disaster. Yep, it's our theory that this class powers up some of the more destructive abilities in the Druid's repertoire, specifically the ones that produce natural disasters like earthquakes, lightning storms, whirlwinds, and so on. So that's literally everything about Mare's classes. Now let's finish off this power profile by looking at his selection of weapons. Mare's go-to piece of equipment is his staff, a divine class weapon called the Shadow of Yggdrasil. Yggdrasil, aside from being the name of the video game that Heinz was playing, is actually a reference to the world tree in Norse mythology. It's said to be the origin of the universe itself. In the game world, this idea was adopted into the lore. The 9 playable servers in the game are the 9 remaining leaves on the world tree. All other leaves were either eaten by the World Eater or fell from the tree and turned into world items. Incidentally, this is why world items are called, well, world items. They are literally as powerful as an entire world. In any case, the Shadow of Yggdrasil would presumably be an item that was derived from this world tree in some way. It's probably not an actual branch of the tree itself, as that would make it about as powerful as a world item, which it isn't. Rather, perhaps it could be seeds or leaves of Yggdrasil that fell and sprouted newer, smaller trees in its shadow. Thus the name Shadow of Yggdrasil, a divine class item that is but a small portion of a much larger world-class tree. Aside from this cool lore theory, we really don't know much about it other than its use in bashing in people's knees or creating earthquakes. Staffs in Yggdrasil worked much like Dungeons & Dragons, in that they could be used to cast spells like a scroll or wand, except the user could select from a much larger selection of spells, not just one. Additionally, in a feature exclusive to Yggdrasil, they also improved the user's spellcasting ability. They weren't actually necessary to cast the spells, but they would make them much more powerful. Then, though not exactly Mare's personal possession, she has been seen to wear the pair of gauntlets called Avarice and Generosity, an actual world item, ranking it as one of the most powerful pieces of equipment in the game for its practically game-breaking abilities. It's one of the few world items that was obtained by the guild Ainz Ul Gon. This particular one had the dual ability of creating and administering XP. The black gauntlet, Avarice, absorbed the souls of slain creatures and converted it into XP. Then the white gauntlet, Generosity, gave the user the ability to use that XP to power any spell that they wanted, including the most powerful ones like Ainz's Wish or various resurrection spells. It was very useful for players who were already at the highest level. It allowed them to stockpile large quantities of experience, giving them a pool of XP that wouldn't take away from their current level. That said, it might require the user to actually be the one to kill the enemy in order to absorb any souls, because in the light novel, we aren't actually told how these gauntlets manage to absorb anything. And that brings us to the end of everything that you need to know about Mare's build, powers, abilities, and equipment. He may not be the strongest in Nazarick, but he is definitely a top tier spellcaster. And it's a shame that we've only seen so little of his potential abilities. I'm sure there's a good reason as to why Ainz always brings him along whenever he's about to engage an enemy. But oh well, guess we just gotta wait for the next unfortunate army to approach Nazarick's gates. Time to answer the second part of the question that I posed last video. How strong is Aura Bellafiora? Well, her build is completely different from Mare, in the sense that though she may not be this elite spellcaster, she is a master of guerrilla warfare, and has a variety of monsters and savage beasts under her command. So let's see what exactly went into Aura's build that makes her known as being the renowned trainer with the indomitable will. Aura's class archetype is that of a cross between a ranger and a beast tamer. Specifically, she has 5 levels in ranger, 5 in shooter, 5 in sniper, 5 in beast tamer, and another 10 in high tamer. The ranger, as a fantasy role-playing game archetype, is actually based on that of Aragorn, one of the main characters from J.R.R. Tolkien's classic The Lord of the Rings series. You see, before the main events of the plot, Aragorn had been a member of the Dunedain Rangers of Arnor, a secretive group of men who lived in the forest to the north of Middle-earth, and they descended from humans, elves, and half-elves. It's because of this that they had incorporated many aspects of elvish culture into their own. It's for this reason also that rangers such as the ones that we see in Overlord or fantasy RPGs tend to inherit many elvish aspects as well, as in they're usually adept with both a sword and a bow, and skilled at surviving off the land by means of hunting, fishing, camping, and so on. Oh, and they also make for excellent trackers and scouts. Dungeons & Dragons developed and popularized this archetype, and in the edition that Maruyama heavily borrows from, they have various special abilities that can be found in common with the druid class. These include befriending wild animals, recruiting an animal companion to fight in battle, moving through restrictive or dangerous terrain with ease, tracking others while moving at full speed, easily evading certain magical spells, camouflaging themselves in any area, and limited support, utility, or nature-related spellcasting abilities. They could also choose to specialize in 2 types of fighting, either with 1 weapon in each hand or through a bow, and they would gain various bonuses depending on which specialization they chose. But out of these ranger aspects that I've mentioned, as far as spellcasting is concerned, it's not been specified that Aura has any of these capabilities. In fact, she actually has 0 magic attack. So for this reason, we'll ignore that aspect for now. It would also seem that Maruyama spun the ranger-based beast tamer skills into a different class, so we'll dig deeper into those a little bit later. Now, one of the core features of Yggdrasil that heavily applies to the ranger class was the need to level multiple different classes in order to complete a single build. If you recall, no class in Yggdrasil had a higher level than 15. So players were forced to pick and choose between the ones that they wanted to specialize in until they got to level 100. But that didn't mean that you had to spread yourself thin across unrelated types of classes. No, Yggdrasil had many nested class trees, meaning as you progressed through the game with a single base 1, more classes related to it would be unlocked, and you could start investing levels towards those. The Ranger was one of these base classes, and every time a new class related to it was unlocked, you could become a more specialized type of ranger, and you would gain new abilities or features related to the path that you were specializing in. Now, while most ranger class capabilities are unknown, we do know that one of its core features in Yggdrasil was stealth and stealth detection. This made Aura extremely proficient at tracking, so many of the ranger-derived classes appear to grant player improvements to both their stealth and stealth detection related skills. Though to get the full benefits of these improvements, you'd have to consistently level into classes that built upon the ranger-based class, otherwise you'd only be partially skilled at them. This was important because powerful concealment spells and higher level stealthy enemies required more levels in ranger-related classes to detect. To put it simply, a very specialized rogue or powerful illusionist spellcaster would have to be countered by an equally specialized ranger. And considering what we've talked about so far, it's probably clear that all of Aura's known classes could very well be Ranger subclasses. I mean, archery specialty and beast taming are major known functions of the Ranger archetype. As for her remaining 70 unknown levels, it could be that she has a few of them devoted to certain other classes, but since we don't know anything about them, there's really no point in speculation. It may be that a few of Aura's classes don't improve her stealth detection, but the vast majority of them probably do, and so it's likely she has the stealth capabilities of a nearly level 100 Ranger. We've actually seen some of this in action. We know for a fact that Aura can see straight through the basic level 3 invisibility spell as if it were nothing. She used it to spot the Naga Ryuvarius, the Serpent of the West, during the events of Season 3 as we see here. She can even see through the level 9 spell Perfect Unknowable, one of Ainz's most powerful stealth spells, which when cast on a target, erases all presences of them, including sight, sound, and smell. That said, her ability to see through it isn't perfect. It only allows her to get a vague idea of the enemy's existence, as well as its approximate location. A similar mechanic also applies to her ability to track or hide from others. She can nearly erase her own presence, as well as spot even the barest traces of her opponent. And so you would need to be a ranger or thief of a similar level in order to spot her hiding from you, or evade her ability to track you. Of course, her stealth ability isn't outright invisibility, but for how effective it was, it might as well be equivalent to the Perfect Unknowable spell. I mean, she was able to effortlessly shadow Ainz in his disguise as Momo while he was escorting the Swords of Darkness through the Forest of Taub, and the Silver Adventurer Lucret never even had a chance of spotting her due to the massive level difference between him and Aura. Now, Aura's levels in Shooter and Sniper are definitely archery-related classes, or more specifically, given the relatively broad name, it's likely that these classes improve the user's effectiveness with multiple different types of projectile weapons, like crossbows, bows, guns, or whatever. Just look at Shizu Delta. She also has levels in Sniper and her primary weapon is a gun. You might even be able to shoot magic spells or fire a cannon more accurately, but that might be a little bit of a stretch. Anyway, knowing that Aura has Shooter and Shizu has Gunner, Sniper probably requires levels in some kind of advanced range classes like these before it actually becomes available. It's a more refined ranged class that would improve the user's ability to hit targets from extremely long distances. If you remember, the guild member Peroncino actually specialized in killing even level 100 players from over 2 kilometers away with a single powerful shot from his bow. That's not to say that Aura could necessarily do the same. Her classes and build aren't nearly as specialized towards that as his. But the point is that Sniper truly was a class for sniping enemies over a long distance, not just be a better archer. So there's no doubt that Aura has quite a few archery related abilities, but there are only a small selection that are made known to us. Out of the few that we are aware of, we have Shadow Piercing Arrow, which restricts her opponent's movements by pinning their shadow in place, Rain Arrow, which fires a large quantity of arrows to rain down upon a target, Galactic Shot, whose functionality is unknown but probably involves firing a powerful meteor-like shot with special properties, and then Sky Eye, a long-range observation skill that creates a disembodied eye that allows the user to spy on an area. Think Gaara's eye skill from Naruto. Aura had actually used it to watch over Ainz's fight against Shaltir. So if I had to guess, Sky Eye would be the perfect class skill for a sniper, as it lets them scout the enemy's position from a great distance away, whereas the other three are more for adding variety to the shooter's skill set. Finally, Aura has the 15 combined levels in Beast Tamer and High Tamer, which both grant the ability to tame and train wild animals or magical creatures into servants or pets. She could also buff them with various skills. This class probably required levels in another class, one like Druid or Ranger, that granted the player animal companions, and it expanded this small feature into its own class, improving its capabilities accordingly. It likely expanded the number of creatures that a character could recruit. For contrast, Mare only has 2 high-level dragons, while Aura herself has hundreds of creatures under her control, all of whom populate the 6th floor. While the majority of them are unknown, we know of 2 by name, Fen of the species known as Fenrir, and Quadrasil of the species known as Idzamna. There's also technically a 3rd known creature, though it's a bit of a spoiler, as it's one that she acquires from the New World during an arc that's not yet covered in the anime, so keep an eye out for that one. Anyway, Fenrir were a type of large magical wolf-like creature, named after the son of the Norse god Loki. In Yggdrasil, one of their notable abilities is to maximize their traversal speed over long distances by ignoring movement and terrain penalties. This effectively manifests as the ability to traverse effortlessly across land at will, with the ability to pass through plants and even the ground itself as if it were immaterial, if it's so desired. As a result of this, they made for quality mounts and trackers, assuming that you could tame them, that is, since they were also ferocious beasts. Itzamna, on the other hand, were gigantic chameleons with the power to manipulate lightning. They were also extraordinarily fast, primarily as a result of their 6 powerful legs, and just as you'd expect from a chameleon, they could also camouflage their presence. But let's get back to Aura. The taming ability itself seems to manifest as intimidating a creature into submission. The Beast Tamer would effectively project a wave of intimidating aura at the target, and the creature becomes so terrified that it can never even think of opposing the Beast Tamer ever again. Imagine it like how Hilma was reacting to Aura at the end of Season 2. Now, how long it takes or how powerful of a foe that it will work on seems to depend on the level of the Beast Tamer. It's also possible that the quantity or total combined power of controlled animals at any one given time might be limited by the strength of the Beast Tamer, though it's very likely that the player could stockpile as many creatures as they wanted. This would come at a cost though. Permanent allied creatures in Yggdrasil accrued upkeep costs, mainly food in the case of animals and beasts, and we can see this feature across Nazarick. I mean, after all, Aura isn't the only one with servants under her command. Shaltir has her vampire brides and Demiurge has his demon lords. However, neither of those were acquired directly through a class skill of theirs like Aura's Beast Tamer. You see, it was a general rule in Yggdrasil that permanent allied NPC creatures required upkeep, whereas any temporary summons were free. For instance, the majority of the servants of Nazarick, who were not custom-created NPCs like the Floor Guardians, were known as mercenary vassals, beings created by obtaining a magical contract item that summons a permanent servant under your control, which you can then use to attack other players or defend your guild base. This was how Shaltir's vampire brides and Demiurge's demon lords were acquired. They accrued daily upkeep costs, in addition to requiring a large amount of initial Yggdrasil gold in order to create. But it was still one of the most popular ways of creating a permanent servant. Summon spells, on the other hand, costed mana, or they used class or race-specific summon skills. Though these skills and spells had usage limits, and only one could be active at a time. So you could either have a single powerful summon or a group of weaker summons at any given time. Now, in contrast to how permanent summons were limited through gold, these summons were limited by time and quantity, making them temporary. For example, Demiurge's demon lords, which are permanent since they've been summoned through a mercenary vassal, can also be summoned through his class skills, meaning he could summon multiple identical copies of them if he wanted to. The reason why I'm telling you all this is because the Beast Tamer class was like a mix of these two approaches to gaining servants. The beasts were permanent like the mercenary vassals, but they didn't require any gold to upkeep. Instead, it required a specific class or race like the temporary summon spells, making their limitation being that it took precious levels away from your build and restricted your potential allied creatures to a narrow range of what's likely just animals and magical beasts. It's doubtful that they could acquire entities like plant creatures, fairies, or even elementals. Now, you might be wondering, why bother spending so many levels to create a powerful beast tamer if you could just throw a little bit of extra cash at the problem and get just as good of a powerful magical beast via a mercenary contract? Well, part of it was because a significant portion of the game was tied very heavily to its economy in a hyper-realistic manner. And what I mean by that is that unlike many MMOs, which suffer from inflation as players stockpiled millions of currency, Yggdrasil was filled with what you could call gold sinks. Pretty much everything you did required money, and anything that you could do for free by specializing in some specific class or race could also probably be imitated by spending money. For instance, every spell could be turned into a scroll, which would grant any user, even non-spellcasters, the ability to cast it without the expenditure of mana. Many spells could also be turned into wands or imbued into staffs, and then be casted multiple times, not just once like with scrolls, meaning that if you wanted to, you could store an entire army of thousands of creatures into a single wagon filled with scrolls that summon monsters. Another example is that gear wasn't permanent. You would drop it if you died, and they took damage as it was used. That being said, money was the easiest way to repair or buy new gear. So basically, you could spend your way out of any problem. Therefore, in a way, the Beast Tamer class was also very useful for saving gold, since it let you put the spend that would normally go towards NPC summoning towards something else. Of course, you weren't just getting cheap creatures from the Beast Tamer class. It also granted the user the ability to enhance and buff allied beasts. This comes down to another general feature of Overlord's class balance. Just because you can imitate most capabilities with gold doesn't mean that those capabilities will be at full power. Spells scaled in power both with respect to the skill of the caster and the level of the spell. Spells cast through items would generally be in their weakest form by default. It didn't matter if the person using or making them was an extremely high-level caster. For instance, if Ainz was to cast his signature, Grasp Heart, it'll likely kill an opponent with high resistances, whereas a scroll that contains that same spell probably wouldn't. Similarly, there's no way to truly imitate the full range of capabilities of a Beast Tamer without being a Beast Tamer yourself. And while it's not clear what exactly a Beast Tamer can do to power up their allies, they do have a lot of buffs that they can give. But so far currently, we know of only one ability that they do have, and that's an unnamed skill that modifies their breath to produce supernatural effects. Put simply, Aura's breath can manipulate the mental state of nearby targets, creating various buff and debuff effects. This could very well be the core class ability of the Beast Tamer, and the primary way in which they enhance their animals. Or it could just be one of many such skills they have. But based on the information that we've been given, it seems to be an at-will ability, with no limit on the number of times it can be used per day. It has a maximum range of about 10 meters, depending on the effect that the user wishes to create, though it can also be massively expanded in combination with other skills. Now, one effect that we know for sure comes from this breath is fear, which causes those afflicted by it to cower from the user, in addition to taking significant penalties to all other actions. That said, given the description of the breath skill, it can probably inflict other mental status effects, such as panic, charm, confusion, nausea, stunning, or whatever. It might even be able to control the user's mind and make them see or hear things that aren't actually there. But that's not to say that it can't be used to grant buffs either. It can also likely inflict positive mental status effects such as morale boosts. Exactly how powerful these positive and negative status effects are though, aren't quite known. But I could see it being quite OP if this type of skill has a high success rate against similar leveled opponents. It's actually been theorized that Aura uses this skill in Ainz's battle against Shaltir. We know that during the end of the fight, just as Ainz is about to finish Shaltir off, he hesitates. Aura, who had been monitoring the battle the whole time with her Sky Eye skill, notices this, and she uses some kind of ability to briefly distract Shaltir and ensure that Ainz has time to finish her off. Specifically, Aura makes it appear as if some hostile enemy presence was standing beside her, which causes her to glance towards it for a split second. I mean, her breath is the only known mind-affecting ability that Aura has, and since we know its range can be enhanced to extremely long distances, then it's highly plausible that this is exactly what happened here. The only issue here is that Shaltir should normally be immune to mind-affecting abilities. Even Aura herself notes that this is a strange paradox. It's possible that, like how Aura can increase the range, she might also have a limited use skill that lets it bypass immunities. A more likely theory though is that immunity in Yggdrasil and the New World means slightly different things. In Yggdrasil, a spell would just fail to have any effect if it was used against a target that was immune. However, in many cases in the New World, it seems that being immune just means that the resulting effect is extremely weak. For instance, during Ainz's fight with Shaltir, he attempted to restrain her with his spell Hold of Rib, despite the fact that Shaltir was immune to mobility restriction effects. But in both the light novel and the anime, we see that Shaltir was immobilized, at least for a brief moment anyway. Still, nonetheless as a result of his spell. Or take Ainz himself as an example. His emotional suppression is supposed to be a result of his immunity to mental effects, but he can still experience brief flashes of strong emotions, albeit only temporarily. Perhaps a similar effect occurs as a result of Aura's ability. It briefly distracts Shaltir, not enough to actually cause the intended effect, but just enough to allow Ainz a window to finish her off. Anyway, enough about this breath skill. To finish off the Beast Tamer aspect of Aura, these levels could also improve her proficiency with a whip. I mean, back during the circus acts of the early 20th century, the whip was a very stereotypical part of the Lion Tamer. Perhaps because of this, the whip appears to be Aura's main melee weapon. If for some reason fighting from long range with her bow wasn't an option, a whip would allow Aura to make use of her natural agility and evasiveness by striking at an enemy from medium range without allowing them to get close enough to hit her. Now, one final interesting thing about Aura's build is that she has the lowest total stat pool among all the known level 100 NPCs, even lower than Demiurge. The main reason for that is that her magic attack stat is 0, and her MP stat is 15. She's just not a spellcaster. But not only that, the rest of her stats are in the low 80s as well. even if you ignore the MP and magic attack stats of physical attackers like Albedo, Cocytus, or Sebas, their other stats are mostly in the high 80s or low 90s. Mare is so weak, in fact, that her physical attack at 75 is actually tied with her brother's. He even beats her in physical and magic defense as well. Only her HP, agility, and special are higher, which makes sense as Mare is a magic caster class, while she has all her beast tamer related skills. The only level 100 NPC who isn't a better physical attacker than her is Demiurge, since the majority of his abilities are dedicated to summoning, buffing, and supporting his allied demons. Knowing this, it's reasonable to theorize that all of Aura's investment in the beast tamer classes to recruit and buff powerful bestial servants came at the cost of her own combat prowess, which now seems to be a recurring pattern in Yggdrasil. Those with the abilities that support or enhance others are in fact weak themselves. So we've covered Aura and Mare separately, gone through their skills, abilities, strengths, and weaknesses, but what does all that mean in the grand scheme of things? How do they stack up against everyone else in Nazarick, and how would they perform in combat? I mean, there must be a reason why they were both chosen to guard the same floor together. So let's actually answer the question of how strong are Aura and Mare, and finally wrap up this joint character profile of the Dark Elf twins. Based on their stat pools, Mare is a good all-rounder, and Aura is a support specialist, but by themselves, neither of them would be particularly powerful enough to take on a 1v1 specialist like Shaltir. They just don't have the sustained DPS output over time of someone like Cocytus or Sebas, and neither of them could execute a powerful burst attack from a build like those belonging to Obertalain Odal, Pararanchino, or Nishikion Rai. So what would be their role in combat? Fundamentally, the two of them specialize in large group battles. The majority of Mare's spells have a massive area of effect, and are very good at delaying, damaging, or outright destroying enemy armies, while Aura has a large army herself of very powerful magical creatures. In a traditional head-to-head battle, Aura might command her beasts from the center, using her breath to buff them all. Meanwhile, Mare would sling his massive spells from the rear, calling down lightning storms and tornadoes to sow chaos in the enemy formation. But it would seem that their capabilities are much better used in guerrilla tactics. In fact, they seem to be custom fit for the floor that they were tasked with guarding. If you remember, we talked a little bit about the major features of the 6th floor of Nazarick, including the fact that it was covered mostly by forest, and we mentioned that Aura and Mare were its floor guardians. By now, it should be a lot more clear as to how and why they were best suited to guard this dense forest. Any large enemy moving through the floor would need to be able to navigate at least portions of the dense forest that blanketed the terrain, slowing down their progress if any of them weren't proficiently skilled. There could even be forest-related traps like poisonous flowers or fungi. Many of Aura's creatures could also probably utilize this forest to camouflage themselves and launch ambushes, whittling down small groups of enemies before regrouping and preparing for another ambush. And they're likely much more mobile than any intruders that would be on the floor, since we know for a fact that some of them can ignore any debilitating effects of the terrain. Aura herself could use her Sky Eye skill to monitor the area even through the dense forest. Her breath skill, primary weapon, ranged attacks, and stealth proficiency would synergize well with her powers of observation, allowing her to strike at enemies even through the concealment and cover provided by the terrain. Meanwhile, Mare could enchant or animate the various trees or plants to attack foes, possibly even teleporting from tree to tree while casting spells. His terrain manipulation could confuse the enemy, as they wouldn't necessarily be able to see the changes in the topology of the environment, given all the trees that block their field of view. And he would also be able to support Aura's beasts with his own assortment of buffs and even healing spells. But that's not to say that these tactics couldn't be employed in other kinds of terrain. It's just that they'd be highly effective on the 6th floor. Of course, as NPCs, they probably wouldn't have been able to do such complex teamwork in the video game Yggdrasil, since that would require some pretty advanced AI scripts that the video game simply didn't support. But Eins Ul Gon was a role-playing guild, and most of the NPCs were designed for roleplay reasons. That said, remember, Buku Buku Chugama played a tank, and was a raid group leader in the guild. As a matter of fact, she was one of the most skilled at what she did. So, she may have been considering all of the factors that went into performing a successful raid when creating their builds, and used that knowledge to build Aura and Mare in a way that would make it as hard as possible to traverse the 6th floor, coming up with tactics and strategies that only a skilled raid leader would consider. So it's possible that Aura and Mare could have just been more of a fun thought project than an actual defense force. Of course, the two Floor Guardians and their army of magical creatures would still work decently well as a defense force, even if they didn't behave as intelligently as a real player. Fortunately, now that Nazarick and its NPCs have been moved to the New World, they have the ability to easily employ such advanced tactics if Nazarick was ever attacked, though that will likely never happen. What's more important is that this free will has allowed Ainz to delegate other responsibilities to them. They don't just spend all of their free time mulling around in the 6th floor. The pair of them have been kept fairly busy doing all manner of things for Ainz, both on and off the screen. Mare's primary responsibilities so far have mainly required the use of his magic, while Aura has been responsible for managing and conquering the wilderness around Nazarick. Going into more detail, if you'll recall back in Season 1, one of the first things that Ainz orders Mare to do is to disguise Nazarick via terrain manipulation magic, namely by surrounding it with various hills in order to camouflage its profile on the horizon. He had issued this order early on, back when he didn't really know how strong he or Nazarick was relative to everyone else in the New World. You see, after being told that the base was no longer in the swamp that it originally occupied in Yggdrasil, Ainz became concerned that Nazarick would be too easily discovered. So, after Mare was finished, the only people who could find Nazarick would be those who stumble directly on top of it by accident, those who pass over it using flight magic, or those who could scan the area from above via divination magic. Now, Mare might have also been involved in the creation of the Green Hole, the settlement of lizardmen and plant creatures that's being used as a farm on the 6th floor. The name came from the fact that it was located in a vast clearing right in the middle of the forest. From above, it looked as if a hole swallowed up everything that was once there. Now, unless this clearing had already existed, it's likely some nature manipulation magic would have been used to clear out the trees in the area. In any case, we know he goes there every once in a while to cast some weather manipulation magic in order to produce rain to irrigate the crops and the plant creatures. This is because the 6th floor doesn't properly model any weather effects aside from the wind. Lastly, Ainz also entrusted Mare to guard him during the massacre of Cat's Plains in Season 3. I briefly mentioned this in Mare's video, but Ainz had equipped him with the world item Avarice and Generosity, the one that absorbs the souls of slain creatures, then grants the user XP to power certain extremely powerful spells and abilities. Of course, if absorbing XP was the only reason why he brought Mare along, then he wouldn't need him. Ainz could just wear the gauntlets himself. So why was Mare there? You see, Ainz came up with a trap, using himself as bait. His plan was to charge up the super tier spell that we saw, knowing that the cast time of it was very long. If another high-level player saw him casting this, they would immediately know what was happening, and it would be expected for them to launch a surprise teleportation ambush or sniper attack, as interrupting him during the cast time would put his super tier spell on cooldown and negate its effect. Having stood there for several moments while charging this ability during a battle between one of the two largest nations, this was the final piece of evidence that he needed to confirm that there were no high-level players even remotely connected to any of the major nations present. But if there were, his plan to use himself as bait would have potentially put him in danger. So it's reasonable to conclude that he trusted Mare to guard him from any surprise attacks during this preparation period. In fact, the author has stated that Mare is just below Shalter in combat power. That makes him one of the strongest in all of Nazarick, and given that only a world item can protect the wielder from the effects of another world item, that made the gauntlet serve yet another purpose. All in all, they would protect Mare from other world items, absorb XP from any of the people killed, then potentially enable Mare to freely use some of his most powerful spells without regard for their XP costs. It's a piece of equipment that's perfect for someone like Mare, who has very high tier area of effect spells. Other than that, Mare also has his Shadow of Yggdrasil staff to serve as his primary weapon, but we already talked about that before, so we'll just move on. On the other side of things, we have Aura, who's basically been working alongside Cocytus to conquer everything around Nazarick for miles. The bulk of this took place after the events of Volume 8, aka the first few episodes of Season 3, which, if you remember from our cut content video, the anime actually retconned some of the timeline of the source material, rearranging certain events to take place in an order that wasn't consistent with the novels. This is important to know because the attack on Carne Village was supposed to take place early on, shortly after the events of the Lizardmen arc, the first major offensive outside Nazarick. It was back when Ainz was still very cautious of other high-level players, and paranoid about drawing attention to himself. Thus, the attack on Carne Village ended up taking place before Cocytus and Aura had enough time to properly bring the areas surrounding Nazarick under control. In any case, the job was divvied up as follows. Cocytus was to work alongside the Lizardmen and focus on demi-human tribes, essentially subjugating through conquest anything was something remotely close to a civilization. They were made to be placed under the banner of Ainz Ul Gown, much the same way that the Lizardmen were. Meanwhile, Aura was largely put in charge of scouting the terrain and handling all the wild, feral, or solitary beasts. I mean, she is a collector, so much of her time was spent looking for particularly cool or interesting ones. As a result, she didn't really pay any attention to any of the weaklings. And by weaklings, I mean pretty much anything that was weaker than Hamske. So basically anything under level 40, which for perspective is about as powerful and dangerous as Gazef Stronov. Because of this, when Ainz questioned her about the Giant of the East and the Serpent of the West, she had no clue as to who they even were. This was a bit of a black mark on her reputation as a servant, as Ainz had trusted her to properly scout the terrain and all of its inhabitants, not just the ones that she thought were cool. In addition to scouting, she also oversaw the construction of a decoy Nazarick, with Ainz assigning her various undead laborers. In the long term, its only real purpose was to be used as a potential storehouse for materials, but in the short term, its purpose was multifold. They could trick enemies into thinking it was the real location of Nazarick, then lure them into a trap. Alternatively, if the real Nazarick was discovered and a major assault was launched, surviving members could regroup there in order to organize a counteroffensive. Like I said, Ainz was very concerned that other powerful level 100 players from Yggdrasil might have also been sent to the New World, and he wanted contingency plans in case they ended up to be hostile towards Nazarick. But ultimately, the base ended up being a narrative red herring that was never used for either of these two purposes. Anyway, those were Aura's responsibilities. Now, the final aspect to complete her power profile are her weapons. Just like Mare, she has a main one and a world item. Based on the little knowledge that we have, her primary weapon is some kind of powerful bow, but she also has a secondary weapon called Queen, the whip that we saw her use back in Season 1. Both are pretty typical for her Ranger and Beast Tamer build, but obviously it's the world item that's the most interesting in her arsenal. It's called Depiction of Nature and Society, and just like how Mare was assigned Avarice and Generosity, Aura was likewise awarded a world item for protection. Ainz really didn't want another Shaltir case happening. Back to the item though. It looks like a large scroll with the image of a landscape, and its ability allows it to trap a group of people, including the user, over an extremely large area inside a pocket dimension of the user's choosing. Escaping the location required those that were trapped to either defeat the user in battle or find one of these special escape points, and successfully doing either would instantly end the effect and automatically take the world item away from the original user and give it to the individual who had escaped. So, if you're planning on using this item, then you better know for sure that you can take on the people that you're trapping. Otherwise, sooner or later someone is gonna find an exit and you're gonna lose your world item. The user can select from several potential locations, which are depicted as paintings on the scroll itself, and the number of escape points depended upon the terrain that the user chose. Generally, the more dangerous the terrain, the more escape hatches there would be for the opponent. A couple examples of terrains depicted on the scroll would be unbearably hot locations, ones filled with lava and all kinds of other heat-related hazards, or even a location that gave the user a free army at their disposal, though that army would be automatically scaled to be of smaller size and weaker strength than the opponent's force. This was a useful item in its own right, and of course an excellent choice for an NPC like Aura, for her specialization in group battles. Other than that, Aura has in her possession an old belonging of Buku Buku Chagama, a wristwatch rewarded to her for her loyal service to Nazarick. Ainz also gave her the Ring of Sustenance, which allows her to go without food, drink, or sleep. Still though, Ainz liked to run Nazarick as ethically and responsibly as possible, giving his employees time for breaks. So the watch would help Aura keep track of time for things like the shifts during her construction job or during her excursions and scouting operations outside of Nazarick. Similarly, while many NPCs are undead or otherwise require no sustenance, Aura and Mare are one of the few that actually do. That's why the ring is pretty useful. It not only reduces the expenses associated with needing to feed Nazarick denizens, but it also helps Aura during her scouting operations. By contrast, Mare was given a ring of Ainz Ul Gown, which allows him to teleport freely between the various floors of Nazarick. Mare has this ring because he spends a lot more time in Nazarick, and Ainz wanted to make traversal more convenient for him. But Aura didn't get one because Ainz was paranoid that someone from outside Nazarick might try to obtain it and use it to infiltrate the base. It's for this reason that it's forbidden to take one outside of Nazarick, and since Aura spends so much time outside of it anyway, she wouldn't even have a use for the ring. But yeah, that's pretty much everything about Aura and Mare. If you made it all the way to the end, then please do let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget that the Succubé merch is still available, and I do talk about Overlord every week on Twitch. So, if you want to check either of those out, then feel free to do so through the links in the description. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!